Welcome back, everyone, to our Bible Origins series through the Pentateuch. Today, we're going to be jumping into the book of Numbers. And Numbers, like some of the other books and writings in the Torah and as well throughout the entirety of the Bible in the New Testament, we see a similar structure called chiastic structure. And we see this in the book of Numbers. It's a mirrored structure. So we've already seen that a few times. The whole Torah as a whole kind of functions as a mirrored structure, with Leviticus being in the middle. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about that when we hit Deuteronomy and wrap up the Torah and the Pentateuch. But we see a chiastic structure here in Numbers. We'll see the people rebel and God sends fire. Excuse me, in Numbers chapter 11. The people complain and God provides quail, also in Numbers chapter 11. Then Aaron and Miriam rebel against Moses and his leadership. And then kind of the center point, the focal point, is the people rebel and refuse, excuse me, to enter the promised land. And that's going to be kind of where the chiastic structure points. And what chiastic structure is, I don't know if I've explained this very well yet, but it's mirrored structure. So it's almost like point A, point B, point C. D is the central point. Then you get C inverted, or like the reverse mirror of C, reverse B, reverse A. So it kind of creates this little arrow shape. It's a literary device that emphasizes something repeatedly and then emphasizes this middle point of the chiastic structure, which is Israel rebelling and not entering the promised land. The old Exodus generation is going to die in the wilderness, and a new generation must come. Then the inverted point of C, which is Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, rebel against Moses' leadership. So we see Aaron and Miriam rebelling against Moses' leadership. Then the sons of like the Korahites are doing the same in number 16. The people complain, God provides water instead of quail, and then the people rebel, and God sends the venomous snakes. So we'll cover all those more, but just understand Numbers has a chiastic structure or a mirrored structure, and it's really trying to revolve around this theme that the people are consistently complaining and they're going to be in rebellion to God. And due to that, the old generation, the Exodus generation, is going to have to die out. So the book of Numbers literally in Hebrew means in the wilderness, but we call it Numbers because of the two major censuses that are taken of the Israelites. First, in chapter 1, again, that census is taken of the Exodus, or the people that left Egypt. That generation is taken a census. And then later in chapter 26, we see a census taken of the new generation that's going to start to enter into the promised land. So that's what the book of Numbers means, or how it gets its name. Just to recap a little bit, last week we talked about Leviticus, and Leviticus starts with God speaking to Moses from the tent. And if you remember back, even at the end of Exodus, Moses is unable to enter the tent of meeting or the tabernacle, and God has to speak from the tent. In Leviticus, we see all these feasts and rituals and laws, purification. That way, the people of God who really aren't holy can dwell among a holy God, and his holy presence can dwell among them. So that's what Leviticus is about. Numbers starts on a different note. It starts that the Lord spoke to Moses in the tent. So Leviticus kind of bridges the gap. It's the central portion of the Pentateuch, and it's answering the questions: how do we, as God's people who have these impurities and this unholiness, how do we live in proximity with God's presence? And Leviticus really answers that, and is again pointing to the future Messiah, who ultimately is going to fulfill many of those Old Testament laws and rituals and structures. So Numbers though starts on a little bit better note. Moses is able to go in the tent and he's able to have conversation with God. But as we're going to see, Israel still really can't figure it out. So the big theme, or the big takeaway from today's lesson, is contrasting these ideas of Israel's rebellion, their ability to complain about everything, their lack of faith, versus God's grace and his fullness of faith, his faithfulness. So we're going to see that as kind of a theme as we go on this road trip with the Israelites through the wilderness. And spoiler alert, it's not going to go well for the Exodus generation or the people of Israel. So there's kind of three main locations that we're going to study today on this as we look through the book of Numbers. First is Mount Sinai, which is chapters 1 through 10. Mount Sinai is where they have been up until this point. After they've left Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, they kind of move a little bit, and then they settle at Mount Sinai. Then they're going to head to the wilderness or the desert of Paran, and then we're going to see them venture into the plains of Moab, and then eventually kind of start to move toward the promised land, start to take some promised territory. So Mount Sinai is the place they've been up to this point. This is where Moses goes up on the mountain and meets with God. He has this conversation with God, and he gets the 10 Commandments and the laws, and all of that is taking place at Mount Sinai. The people with the golden calf, that's at the base of the mountain. So all of Israelite has been camped out at Mount Sinai. And we know that they arrived in the 3rd month, and it says that they set out on the 20th day of the 2nd month. So they spent nearly a whole year at the base of Mount Sinai. So everything we've pretty much read in the latter half of Exodus and then into Leviticus is taking place over a year at Mount Sinai. And that's also where the original census is taken. Then they're going to move in the book of Numbers to the wilderness or the desert of Paran. That's where Moses is told by God to send out the 12 spies. They're going to come back and give a report. 10 are going to say, great land, big giants, we don't want to go in. 2 are going to say, let's go in and let's go seize this promise that God's given us. But because of the 10, they're going to kind of stir up the entire nation to walk in fear instead of faith. And instead of going into the promised land, they are going to be judged for their faithlessness. And they're going to actually wander the wilderness for 40 years. And approximately 38 of those 40 years are going to be spent moving around this desert of Paran. So that's where they're going to spend most of this book and a great chunk of their lives wandering this wilderness. This is also where the Korahite rebellion takes place. And then toward the end of the book, we're going to see them settle in the plains of Moab. Kind of some notable events here. Balak is going to hire Balaam to curse Israel. That's not going to go well for either of those guys. And then the new generation comes after the original generation who's left Egypt, and they are going to take a census of them, and then they're going to start settling in the promised land. And then what we're going to see is the end of Numbers really sets up Deuteronomy, which Deuteronomy we'll talk about in a couple weeks here, but it's the second giving of the law. So be looking for that. Here's just a quick map if you're wondering kind of how or where we are in the world and how they were moving. So you'll see they leave Egypt. They'll come all the way down to the Sinai Peninsula where Mount Sinai is, and they will linger there for a while, and then they're going to roam about the wilderness and then eventually move up kind of northeast to Moab, and that's where they're going to kind of dwell for a little bit before they go and start taking the territory, which they won't completely do until book of Joshua and beyond. So here's a couple of traveling stories. So in between their locations, they have to travel. So they're traveling from Mount Sinai to the wilderness of Paran. That's chapters 10 through 12. And there's a couple of key stories there. And then they're going to venture from the wilderness of Paran eventually to the plains of Moab. And that's going to be chapters 20 through 21. There's going to be a couple of key stories there. So in chapter 11, I should say, the people complain about manna and get consumed by fire, and then they end up getting this quail. And in chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron, who are relatives of Moses, oppose Moses in front of the assembly, and Moses has to kind of intercede on behalf of them. And there's just a constant theme in Numbers of the Israelites or people who have some authority trying to take over for Moses or for Aaron or whoever, and it not going well for them. So then in chapter 20, the people complain. They want water again, and Moses, instead of striking the rock as he's instructed, is told to speak to the rock. But instead of speaking to the rock, he actually strikes the rock. So Moses rebels. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. And in chapter 21, the people complain and venomous snakes come out and start biting them. Then there's this whole strange story about a bronze snake, and we'll talk about that more in just a little bit because it's very peculiar, but also has some significance for the New Testament. So this is one of the worst road trips in all of Scripture. We're going to be jumping in. So let's talk about the rebellion of Moses. In Numbers 20, verse 7 through 10, we see this story. And again, God instructs Moses to speak to the rock. He's already taken water from a rock before, and that water was bitter. It was in a place called Mara, which means bitter. But instead, God doesn't tell him to strike the rock. He tells him to speak to the rock. So that's one notable thing. But then what really is going to get Moses in trouble is what he says in verse 10. It says he and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" And he really puts himself in position of God. He's saying, "Do we need to do this? Do me, Aaron, and God need to do this for you?" And he elevates himself from a position of humility to really a position of arrogance and pride. And he assumes that if I just strike the rock like I did before, if I do it the old way that I did it before, I'll get the same result. And water does come forth, but God is going to pronounce judgment on Moses, and Moses will never be able to enter the promised land physically because of this. And so it says Moses struck the rock, and then God speaks to Moses and Aaron, and he says, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." So kind of a harsh judgment, but again, why did God do that? Well, because God was not honored as holy in the sight of the Israelites. Moses dishonors God and elevates himself into a position where he's going to do it his way, not God's way. And I think really has to do with pride and disobedience, which again caused us all these troubles in the first place in the garden. So we see that kind of fall of Moses, just like we see a fall of Noah in the garden, see a fall of Adam in the garden. We see the same type of fall here. So then the next chapter, we get this strange, peculiar story about the serpent, or these venomous snakes, not the serpent, sorry, these venomous snakes. And basically, the Lord sends these as a punishment or a judgment against the people. And the people admit that they've sinned, and they ask, Moses, will you pray to the Lord and take these snakes away? So Moses prayed for the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." So Moses made a snake, a bronze snake, and put it on a pole. Then anyone who was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And a lot of times people are asking, why a bronze snake, and how is this tie and how is this significant? Why is this detail mentioned? So the bronze snake is interesting because the people are told to look at it, and when they see the snake on the pole, to look at it, believe, and they'll be healed. And that's going to be something we'll see later in the New Testament in a different way. But just a little historical context. In 2 Kings 18, King Hezekiah actually has to break this bronze snake into pieces because the Israelites had started to burn incense and actually worship this when they had their high places and Asherah poles and different things. So They actually made an idol out of this later in their history, and Hezekiah actually destroys it. So this is something they kept around, and at first it was maybe just a piece of history, and then started to turn into an idol. But Jesus is actually going to compare himself to this bronze snake. So this is very interesting. In John chapter 3, Jesus is speaking to Nicodemus, and he says, "Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes," again, when they looked at this bronze snake, "may have eternal life." So what's really interesting is God sends these snakes, they bite the people, and then he tells Moses, "Make a snake and put it on a pole. And then when the people look and believe, they will be healed." And it's very interesting that the thing that cursed them with this venom or this fiery illness or whatever that ends up being, rash or poison or whatever. What's interesting is the curse that they have been inflicted with. God instructs Moses to make an image of that curse so that they can look at the curse and be uncursed. So very, very peculiar. But here's what we find out in Galatians 3. It says, "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hung on a pole." And that actually comes from Deuteronomy 21, where it says, "If anyone is guilty of a capital offense and is put to death, and their body is exposed on a pole, you must not leave the body hanging on the pole overnight. Be sure to bury it that same day, because anyone who is hung on a pole is under God's curse." So what Jesus does when he dies on the cross for us is he actually becomes the curse of sin. So as we are cursed with sin and we look upon the curse of sin, Jesus hanging on the cross, and believe, we can be justified through faith and his grace. So it's a parallel story, and it's strange, but really what God is doing is he's using this as a illustration for future generations. Look, just like Moses hung the curse, and the curse being the snake, which is what is cursing you, sin is the curse we're infected with. Jesus is going to become a curse of the law so that way we can be redeemed, and in doing so fulfills the law. So it's a parallel story echoing into the future when Jesus will come as the Messiah to become the curse of sin for us. So pretty cool story. A little strange when you first read it, but when you see the symbolism, it's actually, I think, quite a powerful story. And then last little story of note I want to touch on a little bit is just this unique story about King Balak. So King Balak is the king of Moab, and he actually hires this prophet, Balaam. And Balaam is a prophet for profit, different type of prophet, but he's a pagan seer or prophet, and he hires out his prophetic abilities to apparently, tell people their future or whatever, or call down curses or whatever. So Balaam and his donkey are on his way to go meet Balak, and his donkey actually stops him. There's this really strange story where God actually enables Balaam's donkey to speak to Balaam, because Balaam, even though he's a prophet, can't see what God is doing, which there's a lot of irony in the story, but it's quite a humorous story, because if you think about it, so Balaam's donkey stops, and Balaam beats his donkey, and then tries to go again, beats his donkey again, and then finally, a third time, Balaam's donkey is a girl, by the way, and she speaks up and says, "Hey, have I ever been in the habit of doing this, of being stubborn?" Which is really funny to hear that from a donkey, but and he's like, "No, you actually haven't. You've been a great donkey." And so I don't know what's going on. And then God opens Balaam's eyes, and he can see this angel with a fiery sword, and he realizes, oh, okay, so maybe I'm in the wrong here. And then God tells him not to go visit Balak, and then he goes, "No, I need you to visit Balak, but you're only going to prophesy what I tell you." And when Balaam goes to Balak to cause these curses down, he prophesies the blessing on the nation of Israel repeatedly. And what's really, again, ironic is that while the Israelites are complaining and rebelling in the plains of Moab, what's actually happening is God is orchestrating something that Balak is intending for evil for the good and for the blessing of Israel. So it's just such an interesting story. But while they're in the plains of Moab, the old generation passes away. They take another census, and Balaam is actually up there calling down these blessings on the people of Israel, and they're really unaware of it, I think, at the time. But it's cool just because God honors his covenant to bless Abraham and his descendants, even when other people are trying to cause them to lose their way. Now, Israel will eventually kind of lose their way here with some rebellion and such, but what gets them is the Moabite women come to the men of the Israel camp, and they start having some sexual immorality in the camp, and then they start actually worshiping Baal of Peor. And so this is where they start these idol worship, and so there's again judgment that breaks out against them, and God has to deal with it. So the book of Numbers is kind of a wild book. It's full of Israel just kind of doing the wrong thing repeatedly over and over, but God is faithful to his promise and faithful to his covenant even when we're not. And so that's really the big lesson to take away from the book of Numbers, among other stories and vital information. But in a nutshell, that's kind of the book of Numbers. Our next session will be covering Deuteronomy as we wrap up the Pentateuch. So thanks for joining us today. Here's some discussion questions you can look at and look over as you're going through your study. And I hope you're enjoying these videos and able to continue to dive a little deeper as we go through the Pentateuch. So thanks for watching. Hope you have a great day. We'll see you next time on Bible Origins.